We closed our last lecture by seeing an England that developed as a combination of Celtic law, Anglo-Saxon law, Viking law, Jewish commercial law, the canon law of the church, with possibly a vestige or two of the Roman law tied in as well. Before we see what happens with the common law today, we need to see one more development that is taking place during this time. In 885 AD, a Viking chieftain by the name of Rolf conducts raids in France, going up the Seine River toward Paris. King Charles the Bald of France gives Rolf a peninsula as his own kingdom, in return for a promise from Rolf that he will leave the rest of France alone and will also protect the rest of France from other invaders. And so Rolf establishes his kingdom, and the French know him as Rollo. He calls his kingdom Normandy or Northmandy and makes it the best governed kingdom in all of France. Later Norman rulers adopt much of the French language, much of the French customs and legal concepts, which were far more Roman and more centralized and more absolutist than those of the Vikings or of the Anglo-Saxons. And so they become, in effect, Frenchmen and, in effect, Romans in their view of law. And then comes a very crucial year in English history, 1066. King Edward the Confessor died in that year, and there were three noblemen who claimed the throne. One of them was Harold Godwinson. Harold was the Earl of Wessex, or West Saxony. He was the choice of the governing body, the Witan Gemot. Another was Harold Hardrada, or Harold Hardruler, the King of Norway. He claimed the throne based upon blood relationships. And then William, the Duke of Normandy, a descendant of Rolf, by virtue of his marriage, also claims that he is entitled to the throne. On the 24th of September of the year 1066, Harold Godwinson does battle with Harold Hardrada, and in a hard-fought battle, and as the battle went on during the day, it wasn't clear till the end of the day who was going to win, but Harold Godwinson defeats Harold Hardrada, but then learns at the same time that William of Normandy has landed his forces on the coast. And so he takes his exhausted and decimated army, marches it through a heavy rain to Hastings to face William. And that was probably a fatal mistake. If he had stayed back for a while and gave his troops the opportunity to rest and to gain reinforcements from the countryside, he might well have defeated William, but he didn't. And his exhausted army faced William. Again, it was a hard-fought battle, but near the end of the day, Harold took an arrow in the throat and died, and William the Conqueror became King of England. William was an effective leader. He tried to govern fairly, but the Anglo-Saxons perceived him as favoring the Normans. He was forming a stronger centralized government than they wanted and they were used to, and they felt that they had been governed very effectively, and for a kingdom of about 4 million, organized as decentralized as it was, to be able most of the time to fight off a nation like France with 17 million shows some remarkable organizational skills. But William wanted to centralize more in keeping with the Frankish and the Roman tradition. He formed an advisory council that was called the Curia Regis, that expands into a royal court system, and then also he forms the Court of King's Bench, a Norman institution, which was to take power as much as possible away from the localized shire courts, which were controlled by the Vikings and by the Anglo-Saxons. He compiles a book known as the Doomsday Book, not the same as Alfred's Book of Dooms. The Doomsday Book is really a register of all land titles in England, giving the king knowledge and control of real estate, and gradually he begins confiscating Anglo-Saxon lands and giving them to Norman knights as military fiefdoms in return for their service. But William also retains most of the Anglo-Saxon common law intact. And he also preserves the Witan Gemot, that is the Anglo-Saxons' great council. He simply renames it Parliament, coming from the French word parle, to talk, and he adds Norman representatives to the Parliament. From that point on, much of what we see in English history is a battle between the forces of Parliament and the forces of the king as to which of these governing bodies is really running England. Henry I, who reigns from 1100 to 1135, established a number of legal systems such as writs or letters of command. He established courts of exchequer, which were tax courts, but eventually expanded to take commercial affairs in general. But he also issued the Charter of Henry I of 1100 AD, a charter which promises to return to the common law rules of Edward the Confessor, the last Anglo-Saxon king, and also promises that there will be no changes in the law without the consent of the Witan Gemot, or that is, of the Parliament. Henry Plantagenet, that is Henry II, who reigns in the late 1100s, reasserts Henry I's centralized authority and establishes special inquests with authority to investigate, and even to investigate the local sheriffs or shire reefs, again trying to centralize more power. Richard the Lion-Hearted comes along from 1185 to 1189 to 1199. He is a popular, charismatic, beloved figure. He was devoted to the Crusades, and he was a superb military commander, even by Muslim counts. But in the 10-year reign, he spent probably 6 months in England, and he didn't have text messages or other means to keep in touch, and as a result, there were not many changes, with the exception that a lot of problems were going unaddressed. And then his brother becomes king, John, and John, reigning until 1216, is a very unpopular king. He lacks his brother's charisma. He is blamed for a lot of problems, many of which were not really of his making. He had inherited a bad situation, actually, but he didn't handle it well either. He quarreled with the Pope over the election of bishops, and the Pope placed him under interdiction, that is, declaring that no masses may be said anywhere in England during this time. And if you're a nobleman who believes that the Mass and the sacraments are vital to your salvation, you will certainly put strong pressure on your king to make him get back in line with the Pope and the Church, or else you're going to talk about deposing him. So, faced with the possibility of revolt, John finally reconciles with the Pope and agrees to the appointment of an archbishop, a man by the name of Stephen Langton, to be the Archbishop of Canterbury. Now, Stephen Langton is a great constitutional hero. He is from the town of Lincoln, which is north of the Danelaw, a Scandinavian community, indicating very possibly he himself was of Scandinavian background. He was the first person to actually divide the Bible into chapters, and he did so, we are told, on horseback as he rode among his various parishes. In Archbishop Langton's view, King John, who he'd already have trouble with over his appointment, and John resents Langton because he had to appoint Langton to resolve his interdiction and excommunication. But in Langton's view, John becomes more authoritative, and likewise in the view of Vikings and Anglo-Saxons. And so in 1214, Archbishop Langton gathers the barons and the bishops, many of whom were from north of the Danelaw, and he instructs them in the doctrine of rights and the doctrine of interposition, a doctrine we're going to see later, the 12th lecture, the duty of lesser magistrates to interpose themselves against the higher magistrate on behalf of the people they represent when that higher magistrate becomes tyrannical. He then assists in the drafting, and maybe drafts himself, this document that we know as the Magna Carta. He commissions a nobleman by the name of Robert Fitzwalter with the title of Marshal of the Army of God and Holy Church, and on June 15th of 1215, Archbishop Langton and Marshal Fitzwalter lead the barons and the bishops to Runnymede, where they confront King John and essentially tell King John, this document reestablishes the ancient rights of Englishmen. You either sign it, or else you're going to be looking for a job, and you are not going to get very good references from us. Well, John signs, and there's a lot more to it than that. He later claims that his signature was invalid because he had signed under duress. But the real significance of the Magna Carta is not so much that it is a visionary document of new and unheralded rights. It simply there recognizes the ancient rights of Englishmen, and in that sense, it's a reactionary document protecting those God-given rights against the usurpations of a Norman king. But the real significance of Magna Carta is that it is the first time in recorded English history that a king is forced to sign such a document against his will under threat that he will be removed from office if he refuses to sign. There are quite a number of parallels between the Magna Carta and the year 1100 charter of Henry I, and there are also many parallels with Viking law. The introduction is almost identical to the introduction to the laws of Norway of that time, provides for no royal interference with the election of bishops. You can see possibly why Archbishop Langton himself wanted that inserted. It establishes principles of inheritance and administrators and wardships, makes guardians responsible to exercise due care over their ward's inheritance, rules concerning debt collection, jurisdiction for courts and venue for courts. No taking of private property can be permitted without just compensation, a clause that has found its way into our Fifth Amendment, unfortunately not followed today as it should be. Provides safety for foreign merchants, for ownership of churches. Changes in the law, according to Magna Carta, must have the Parliament's consent. So the Magna Carta serves as a partial check on centralization and expansion of government power. Then comes Henry III. The crisis arises under Henry III in the mid-1200s. May the king appoint his own advisors, or must he have the approval of the Witangmote, or Parliament, for that appointment? They finally reach an agreement, very similar in many respects to Article 2, Section 2, Clause 2 of the United States Constitution, which provides that when the president appoints his advisors, that is, his cabinet officials, that he has to have the advice and consent of the Senate for their appointment. Another major development during this time, between 1250 and 1260, King Henry appointed a man named Henry de Bracton, or Henricus Bracton, as it is sometimes written. He was a church official and a judge, to systematize the Anglo-Saxon common law. And Bracton produced a classic work in English history on the laws and customs of England. Bracton's treatise systematized the common law, filling in gaps and resolving inconsistencies with the canon law and with the Roman Justinian Code. Its stated purpose is that bad men may be rendered good and good men better as well by the dread penalties as by the encouragement of reward. Concerning judges, De Legibus reads, "Let not one who is unwise and unlearned ascend the judgment seat, which is the throne of God, lest he change light into darkness, and lest, like a madman with a sword in his untutored hand, he slay the innocent and set free the guilty." The English legal historian Frederick Maitland says that De Legibus was the crown and glory of medieval jurisprudence, and it was essentially the standard written work on English common law until Blackstone produced his commentaries over 500 years later. From 1272 to 1307, we have Edward I. If you are a Scot, or if all you know about Edward is what you saw in that great movie Braveheart, you will think Edward is the devil incarnate. But the English regarded Edward as a great king, just as they regarded William Wallace as a terrorist, much like Osama bin Laden. He called 45 parliaments during his reign. Thereby, he clearly recognized Parliament's authority. Parliament passed a number of statutes that began to replace the common law, but some of them didn't change it that much. They simply put it in writing. In 1292, he began publishing yearbooks, and the yearbooks were books concerning cases that had been decided during the past year, so that as we are arguing common law tradition, you don't just say, well, my understanding is that back there in Sir Cedric's court 300 years ago, a case was decided this way, and the other would say, well, I understand that might have happened up in Liverpool, but down here in Kent, we had a case 200 years ago that, if I remember correctly, said a regular written yearbook like this that sets out what the decisions of that year were, did much to help systematize the law, although how much use it was actually given is open to question, since as of this time we still don't have a printing press. He also began debtors' prisons. That was his way of making alliance with the merchant class. And he began something that really will mark him as the devil incarnate for law students. It was under Edward I that we first see bar exams as a prerequisite for being admitted to the practice of law. His son, Edward II, was almost as incompetent as the movie Braveheart makes him appear. In fairness to Edward, he really didn't want to be a king, and Parliament agreed, and in 1327 they removed him on charges of general incompetence. As we move down to 1509, we're covering a lot of ground here, but it's necessary to move forward. As we move down to 1509, we see the beginning of the reign of Henry VIII. Now, Henry VIII was a devout Catholic by belief. He had received a medal from the Pope, the Defender of the Faith medal, for a treatise that Henry had written arguing against the theology of Martin Luther. For that, he received this Defender of the Faith medal. Of course, as a Lutheran pastor, I myself would say he should have been burned at the stake for writing that. No, I don't agree with that, but he believed that his kingdom needed a male heir, and since Catherine of Aragon had not given him a male heir, and in Henry's view that was her fault, he determined to divorce her and marry Anne Boleyn. But the problem was the church would not grant him a divorce or an annulment, partly because Catherine of Aragon, his wife, was related to the King of France, who had a lot of influence with the Pope. So Henry pulls the Church of England out of the Roman Catholic Church, constitutes it as a separate church called the Church of England, with the King or Queen of England as its head. Now, this is a novel development, because throughout English history, in fact, throughout the history of at least Western Europe, we see a concept of two kingdoms, church and state. Now, they interact with each other a great deal, sometimes in ways that were not right, but they are separate kingdoms. You don't find kings becoming bishops, and you don't find bishops becoming kings. But here we have the head of the church and the head of the state tied together in one person, the King of England. Gradually, the Church of England begins to move more in a Protestant direction. At the time of its founding, it was essentially Catholic in its theology, just separate in its organizational structure and hierarchy, but gradually it moves to become more and more Protestant in its orientation. Edward VI was strongly Protestant. However, he died at age 16. One of the last things that he said before he died was he wanted to be sure that his Catholic half-sister Mary did not become queen after him. But after a brief interlude, she did, and tried to move the country in a more Catholic direction once again. But after 5 years on the throne, she was succeeded by Queen Elizabeth I, a Protestant, and Queen Elizabeth issued edicts of toleration, which meant that you were free to believe and practice a wide variety of beliefs and practices, so long as you did so under the umbrella of the Church of England. In other words, you might have high church liturgy or low church form. You might have differences in views of baptism and communion, but so long as we're all Anglican, that'll be fine. Now notice, this is toleration. It is not the same thing as liberty. Toleration means we will tolerate you. We have the right and the power to suppress you and compel you, but we won't, at least not for the present time. That's a long way from religious liberty. And after Elizabeth, we move into an era of two major conflicts, Parliament versus the King, and the Puritans versus the Anglicans, and sometimes pro-Catholic, who are in control of the king and his offices, whereas the Puritans are in control of Parliament. The Stuart kings, James I, Charles I, and then Charles II and James II, believe strongly in the divine right of kings, by which they mean that all power comes from God. Now, the Puritans would agree that part, but the power comes from God. It is delegated from God to the king, from the king to lesser magistrates, and from the lesser magistrates to the people. The Puritans in Parliament believe just as strongly that all power comes from God, but God delegates that power to the people. And the people establish the lesser magistrates, the earls and so on in the shires, and then the members of Parliament, and they in turn establish the king. And so the lines of authority are different. And military warfare takes place in the 1640s, and eventually the Parliament accuses King Charles of treason for bringing in foreign troops to make war on the people of England. After all, this is popular sovereignty. They are the true rulers of England, the people themselves, and by making war on the people, Charles has committed treason. Charles refuses to respond to the charges. If he had, almost certainly, he probably could have at least escaped execution. But Charles is faithful to what he believes, and I think we need to give him credit for that. But Charles refuses to even make a defense because he says, this parliamentary body has no jurisdiction over me. They have no right even to accuse me of treason. And in fact, it is the opposite. God has given the power of government over England to me, the king. And if Parliament and its allies are making war against me, it is Parliament and its allies that are committing treason. But Parliament had the more muscle at that time, and Charles is convicted of treason and is executed. We have the brief interregnum in the 1650s, where Oliver Cromwell serves as Lord Protector of England. He died, leaving his son, who was not really capable of taking over for him. And so after the son, then we see King Charles II restored to the throne, followed by James II. And with James II, the members of Parliament felt we can tolerate James because he has no heir, and therefore, once he is off the throne and he's elderly already, then we'll be able to have a true blue Protestant as our king. Well then, though elderly, James's wife does have a male child, and so obviously Parliament cannot tolerate this, and so we have what is called the Glorious Revolution. James is removed from the throne, bloodlessly, I might add, and forced to flee to France. And now William and Mary, strong Protestants, are brought from Holland to become King and Queen of England. Their claim to the throne is based on Mary's relationship to the Stuart kings. There was a man, a member of Parliament, Attorney General, Chief Justice of the Court of Common Pleas, Chief Justice of the Court of King's Bench during this time, named Sir Edward Coke. And Sir Edward Coke wrote a 4-volume treatise titled The Institutes of the Common Law of England. This was studied and cited extensively by Thomas Jefferson, by John Adams, by Patrick Henry, and other of our founding fathers. He also drafted the Petition of Right, which was a petition to champion the rights of man and limit the powers of the king. It was a forerunner of the English Bill of Rights. And he was a strong defender of the power of Parliament over that of the king, and a champion of the common law against encroachments by royal decree. But largely as a result of what Coke had done, Parliament in 1689 adopts the English Bill of Rights. Now, a quick summary of the English Bill of Rights begins by saying, whereas Parliament adopts this declaration, goes on to say that whereas James II tried to subvert and extirpate the Protestant religion and the laws and liberties of the kingdom, and adds particulars to that, and whereas King James II abdicated, and His Highness the Prince of Orange, William, whom it has pleased Almighty God to make the glorious instrument of delivering this kingdom, in order to such an establishment as that their religion, laws, and liberties might not again be in danger of being subverted. We'll find a little later that the Continental Congress in 1774 uses language very similar to that in appealing to the king. They go on and say, and thereupon the lords spiritual and temporal and commons do in the first place, as their ancestors in like case have usually done, for the vindicating and asserting their ancient rights and liberties, declare, and then they declare certain rights. Let's look at these rights. That the pretended power of suspending the laws or execution of laws by regal authority without the consent of Parliament is illegal. That the Crown may not levy money for itself without consent of Parliament. Comparing that to the U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 7, that all revenue has to originate in the House. That it is the right of the subject to petition the king, and all commitments and prosecutions for such petitioning are illegal. Petitioning, as we see it in the First Amendment, that raising or keeping a standing army within the kingdom in time of peace, unless it is with the consent of Parliament, is against law. Article 1, Section 10, Clause 3, that the subjects which are Protestants may have arms for their defense suitable to their conditions and as allowed by law, the Second Amendment. Now, some argue that Catholics already had this right under the Stuart kings, and so this only extended it to Protestants. The Free Speech and Debate Clause, the Excessive Bail Clause, the right to trial by jury, all of these are clauses that find distinct parallels in the U.S. Bill of Rights. Then we find the Hanover kings coming in, then George II, a brave soldier on the battlefield, led troops in battle, and a man, though, who brutally suppressed the independence movement of the Scots, many of whom then in the 1740s were forced to flee for America, particularly in the Carolinas and in Virginia, and who a generation later became the leaders of the American independence movement in a battle against the British. Maybe that's Scotland's revenge in a sense. Then comes George III, a hard-working man, conscientious, religious man, but after 1788 he suffered mental illness, and by 1810 he was definitely insane. However, he reigned until 1820. Blackstone's commentaries were published during his reign. The American War for Independence took place during his reign. Also during his reign, we see the Treaty of Paris, by which American independence is recognized, negotiated On the American side, by Ben Franklin and John Adams and John Jay, the treaty begins by saying, "In the name of the most holy and undivided Trinity," one of the founding documents of the United States, as far as a specific document of England, again showing our Christian foundations. The laws of nature and of nature's God, the basis for our independence and the basis of the common law. And in the next lecture, we'll focus on natural law and what exactly it means.